So today I am going to discuss with you an important, very important topic regarding the wildlife conservation of India, the conservation of wildlife outside the protected areas. So before going to my presentation, what is wildlife? Its definition is simple. Anything growing as wild can be called as wildlife, or any undomesticated fauna and uncultivated flora, we can call it as wildlife. But when we talk about wildlife, the first thing come to our mind is the mega charismatic animals like the elephant or gore or this rhinoceros and all. We are completely ignorant about these small creatures, the invertebrates or the plants, etc., etc. So the wildlife, which encompasses all the uncultivated flora and undomesticated fauna, that should be in our mind before I starting this presentation. So regarding the conservation thoughts, the early conservation thoughts or the evolution of conservation biology, this is generally world over the early thoughts in 1800s regarding our conservation point of view was the romantic transcendental preservation ethic. It was put forward by John Muir in 1800s. So that means the God created the nature or the forest or the wildlife and all, and we have to protect them only because of the sake of the God. If you are exploiting the wildlife or exploiting the nature, means we are undoing the work of the God. So that was our conservation thought. Okay, then later in early 1900s, the resource conservation ethic or utilitarian utilitarian school of thought came into being, and the Gifford Pinchot was the main propagator of this school of thought. That means the nature is for our use. It is for anthropogenic use. Okay, all the natural resources are for use of human beings. So that was the school of thought during these early 1900s, and in late 1900s and 1960s onwards, Aldo Leopold and all put forward this evolutionary ecological land ethics. That means these every organisms are interconnected. Okay, so it came into being in an evolutionary process. So if we are not protecting one organism, that will affect the other organisms as well in the ecological community, and we should have a broad landscape approach towards the conservation goals. So that is the evolutionary ecological land ethics. So still we are following this concept, evolutionary ecological land ethics. So we should have a broader concept regarding the conservation of wildlife. Instead of this narrow, this protecting a small area, protecting a single organism, a single species, that kind of conservation goals will not work. We should have a broad landscape ecological level of conservation. So that is the evolutionary ecological land ethics. Still we are following this, and we have some modern synthesis regarding these molecular concepts, the genetic bank and all. So such kind of modern thoughts are actually strengthening the evolutionary ecological land ethics put forward by Aldo Leopold et al. Okay, so broadly, as we all know, we have broadly two categories of conservation measures: the in situ and ex situ conservation measures. The in situ conservation measures, we know the conservation of the species in its natural habitat itself, like the protected areas, including the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, community reserves, conservation reserves and all, biosphere reserves, sacred groves, etc. And ex situ conservation, we are taking the organism from its natural habitat into an artificial enclosure and keeping them, captive breeding them, like the zoo, zoological gardens, aquaria, botanical garden, etc., etc. So I am today more concerned or talking about the in situ conservation measures. So the in situ conservation measures, we know we have national parks, the wildlife sanctuaries, community reserves, conservation reserves, the biosphere reserves, tiger reserves, important bird areas, Ramsar sites, sacred groves, all these kind of measures. We are protecting the organisms in its natural habitat itself. But here in all these measures, we have only these four categories having the legal protection status. Means these national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, community reserves, and conservation reserves. These are the four categories which is having a legal backup as protected area, because these are declared as protected area under the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. All others are not having any legal backup. They are all just designations for the places by some agencies, or it is not having any legal protection status. So the protected area, defining a protected area, this is a global definition put forward by the IUCN. Okay, so the term protected area was actually defined in the Fourth World Congress on National Parks and Protected Areas. It defines an area of land or sea especially dedicated to the protection and maintenance of biological diversity and of natural and associated cultural resources, and managed through legal or other effective means. Okay, so this is a global, universally following definition of the protected area. But in Indian context, we are using the definition of protected area which is given in Wildlife Protection Act 1972. The clause 24A defines a protected area as a protected area means a national park, a sanctuary, a conservation reserve, or a community reserve notified under the respective sections. Okay, so these four categories only forms the protected area as per the legal definition. Okay, the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. So if you are submitting a proposal, or if you are if any offense happens in a forest area, whether it is falling in a protected area, this definition works. Okay, if it is in a national parks or a sanctuary or a community reserve or a conservation reserve, then only we can call it as it is in a protected area. So then only this punishment or that kind of things will work. Okay, so that is the protected area definition in India, or status in India. So coming to the brief history and development, I am not going into detail. The first national park came in 1935, okay, before the independence, and it was later in 1967 it renamed as Corbett National Park, and the first wildlife sanctuary came in 1936, the Vedandangal in Tamil Nadu, and independent India was designed to preserve its natural resource base through state control of common land, water, forest, etc. So after that, the number of protected areas increased. Okay, when the 1972 Wildlife Protection Act was enacted, that was a milestone. Okay, so which brought more number of area under the protected area status. Okay, so after that enacting of these 1972 Wildlife Protection Act, we had a rapid increase in the number of national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. So the total number of protected areas prior to the implementation of Wildlife Protection Act was just 5. Okay, after that this increased along with the Joint Forest Management JFM started in India in 1988. It was started in West Bengal and later in other part of the country. So that also one of the reason for increasing the national parks and wildlife sanctuaries in India, because the local people were also included in the planning and implementation of the conservation measures in these protected areas. Okay, so later now we have several questions in our mind, like are these national parks and wildlife sanctuaries enough for wildlife conservation in India, or the protection to some forest patches alone is enough for the conservation of wildlife in India, or are there any wildlife rich areas outside the notified forest areas? There are many areas outside the forest area or outside the existing protected area which are very rich in biodiversity or very rich in wildlife. So in 2002, our this 1972 Wildlife Protection Act was again amended and included two more categories, this community reserves and conservation reserves, okay, to address the conservation of biodiversity or wildlife outside these protected areas, outside the national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. Okay, so community reserve, the private area or the land owned by the private people, but which is very rich in biodiversity, then we can declare it as community reserve under the provision of this act. And the conservation reserve, the area is owned by the government, okay, the revenue land maybe, so which is outside the forest, not owned by the forest department. Okay, so such area can be, if it is rich in biodiversity, that can also be declared as conservation reserve based on this the provisions of this act, this amendment. And including those two categories, the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, conservation reserves and community reserve, we have a total of 903 protected areas in India. It's a big number actually, right? It's a big number. When we talk about this number of protected areas, it's a 903, it's a big number, but I will show you what is the reality. Okay, so later in 2006, the Wildlife Protection Act 1972 again amended and brought the tiger reserves also. The tiger reserves, the Project Tiger, it was started in 1973, and all over India we have declared tiger reserves. And in 2006 amendment of Wildlife Protection Act brought these tiger reserves also under this act, under the purview of the act. But here it is actually not adding a new category of protected area. Almost all the tiger reserves are a part of either a national park or a wildlife sanctuary. So it overlaps with the existing the protected areas. And also these tiger reserves are not included in the protected area network in the act. So still we have four categories of protected area: the national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, community reserves and conservation reserves. Okay, and as of now, as of this December 2019, we have a total of 101 national parks. 101 national parks. Okay, in the previous year it is 2000. In 2018 it is 104. Don't get confused. The 3 Button Islands in Andaman Nicobar was clubbed to form the Jhansi this Marine National Park. So that is this 101. Okay, and we have 553 wildlife sanctuaries and 163 community reserves and 86 conservation reserves. So total we have 903 national parks. 903 protected areas. Okay, so as I said, it's a big number, 903 protected areas in India. But when we talk about the area of coverage, okay, the percentage coverage of the country, it is just 5% of the country. This much protected area covers only 5% of the country, total geographical area of the country. And most of the elephant habitats, see this more than 80% of the elephant habitats outside these protected area, and this leopard, tiger habitats, etc., are outside this 5% area. We know that this 5% geographical area of the country is not at all enough to accommodate this much of as per the population of the wild organisms, that is not enough. And also outside this forest area, we have several other biodiversity rich area. We have some facts and figures regarding the conservation point of view in India. Is, India is one among the 17 mega biodiversity nations. We have 2 biodiversity hotspots. India is just 2.4% of the world's geographical area, but we are having 11% of the flora and 6.5% of the fauna of the world, and we have more than 46,000 species of plants, of which 35% are endemic, and we have more than 75,000 animal species. So this much biodiversity we have, this much organisms we have, that much habitat we have in India, and only 5% of the land area of India is under this protected area status. Other areas also there, but legally we have the protected area status only for that 5% area. So that is another thing we have to read along with this is 60.53% of the land area is agriculture, with that to feed 138 crores of people. Sorry for the wrong value. It's 138 crores of people. So that indicates the pressure we have in our natural habitat. Okay. So in our natural habitat, we have that much anthropogenic pressure, and we have only this much area under protection status. And later, when the theory of island biogeography proposed by this MacArthur and Wilson in 1967, that also led to several debate all over the world. That means we need a single large reserve or several small reserves. Means several small protected area is better, or a single large area, or the large reserves are better than several small ones. Okay, there are other side also. Some scientists they are arguing that several smalls are better. So that kind of thought is also there. When we talk about the scenario in India, is the single large or large reserves are better than several small reserves. So in line to that SLOS debate, or in line to that theory of island biogeography, we have several studies conducted in India. A study was undertaken by Wildlife Institute of India in 1988 and again in 2002, and they found that the protected area network in India is inadequate. Okay, and also the global gap analysis by Conservation International in 2003 also showed how these protected areas around the world are not sufficient to meet the conservation needs. Okay, so all these there are several other studies. Even in 2020, like Shetri and all, they had a beautiful study regarding this conservation beyond protected areas. Okay, so several studies are there. All these studies triggered debates and studies to review existing protected area and identified areas of concern outside the protected areas across the different biogeographic zones in India. There are very unique habitats outside the protected areas that we have to identify at regional level, at local level. Okay, we have the mangrove forest. In the previous talk, Professor Nadaf very beautifully narrated the importance of the mangrove forest in India, and there are several wetlands which are still not having any protection status. Means other than this revenue department's regulation measures and all, we don't have any wildlife related protection status for this wetland area. And the riparian habitats, the tropical swamp forest, the laterite hillocks, especially in the west coast area, this, along with that western ghats in the west coast, between this sea coast and the western ghats, in between that we have a belt of laterite hillocks starting from the Kerala to the Dapoli in the Maharashtra. It's a very unique habitat, this laterite hillocks, but it is not at all coming under any of the acts, any of the protection status. Okay, so the sacred groves, the Shola forest, the grasslands, the alpine meadows in the Himalayas, so and these several areas of especially the sandalwood area, the red sanders area, etc., etc. So several areas are there outside the forest, outside the protected area. Also, we should have a species specific habitat or conservation strategies that must be identified at local level. The species specific habitat which is endemic. So in Kerala we have these laterite hillocks, and in last 5 years there are several studies coming out with some endemic plants seen only in the laterite hillocks, but these laterite hillocks are not at all protected and they are under severe mining for the granite stone and also for laterite stone. Okay, so such habitat should be identified at local level and we should have protection measures. Okay, and the species specific strategies, conservation strategies also we should develop, that is possible only through research. But here the main problem is, if you are applying for a research proposal, if it is falling in a protected area, the chance of getting funding is more. And also the other cases are also there. If it is a key species, you will get funding for research. Okay, but studies are very less in our area. I can tell you one classical example regarding this. The salmon fish, it's a migrating fish. Its breeding ground is in fresh water and the upper reaches of the river. And after this hatching, after spawning, these fishlets travel through the freshwater rivers for thousands of miles, taking 1 or 2 years, and they reach the ocean, Atlantic Ocean or Pacific Ocean. Two different species are there. Okay, and they spend rest of their life cycle till their adolescent. They become adult. They spend their life in the ocean, and after that, for breeding, again they will go to their again to the freshwater habitat in the upper reaches of the river. So they travel, they migrate through this river, across this flow of the river, even the fast flowing river, they travel across the river and they reach to the even they have different obstructions during their travel. Even the waterfalls, like they have a special ability to jump across the waterfall, and they move, they swim to their that origin place, where they took birth. So that same location they will reach even after years. So they use a special kind of olfactory signals for this, for identifying that particular river. So there are different studies, very interesting studies in this salmon migration. You can get it through literatures, and they have different obstructions including the predators, okay, the grizzly bears and all. So this salmon migration through this river is that is very crucial for their survival. So these hydel projects, construction of dams across these rivers, that actually creates obstruction for the travel of these salmons. So what the very beautifully designed conservation measure, or the this while constructing these dams or hydel projects, they are building specialized fish ladders for the free movement of the salmon fish. So salmon fish have a special ability to jump across these small waterfalls, and they jump through these fish ladders, and they move across these dams. So this is it's a vision by the or it was developed through research and all. So they have addressed this very beautifully. Okay, the people, the government, etc. of that area, they have identified this very beautiful, and their engineering work is brilliant work. So we too have such organisms or species around us outside the forest. Okay, they are their population is decreasing because of these kind of threats in nature. So we have to identify it through research and all, and outside the forest or in and around our area, we have to identify these and strengthen their conservation measures. Okay, so we have several other categories of protected areas. As I said, we have Ramsar sites, the elephant reserves, important bird areas, biosphere reserves, the wetlands of international importance, UNESCO heritage sites, key biodiversity areas, etc. So even though this is not having the legal protection status, we have to conduct research and all in this area. It is if you are conducting the research in a Ramsar site, you can go for funding and all. So we should have more research and all in this, and also these areas we should upgrade into this protection status. The government or the policy makers or the forest officials and all should think in that line. These areas which are very rich in biodiversity should be upgraded to, or should be brought under the provision of the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. And this key biodiversity area, as I said, it is it is put forward by IUCN. They are identifying these key biodiversity areas. These are vital habitats for the threatened plant and animal species in terrestrial, in land, in freshwater and marine ecosystems. And in order to declare an area as key biodiversity area, there are 11 criteria under 5 broad categories. Okay, so that is very comprehensive. That is very it's a very important key factors are there. So while analyzing those factors, by examining all these criteria, IUCN has identified 531 key biodiversity areas in India. Some are coming under the existing protected area, and majority are falling under or outside the protected areas, the existing wildlife sanctuary, national parks, community reserves and conservation reserves. So these 531 key biodiversity areas is a big number, and that much biodiversity rich areas are outside the forest area or the this protected area status. So that indicates how important is our landscape is, and we are protecting a narrow part of our this very important wildlife rich area. And it was in 2009 the government of India brought a very beautifully a very good conservation measure, this integrated development of wildlife habitats, and that was in 11th 5-year plan, and they have dropped it in 2012, I think. So that was for that period only. and it was a centrally sponsored scheme, and it is having three components. Okay, a support to the existing protected areas and protection of wildlife outside the protected area, and the recovery program of critically endangered species. Okay, so based on this, the areas in India was identified and designated as high value biodiversity area, HVBAs, high value biodiversity areas. So all those areas were outside the protected areas. I have listed just 10 areas in Kerala. We have identified, they have identified HVBAs in Kerala, and they were funding for several research and conservation measures and all for those areas. So such measures, even though that was for that period only, such measures are needed for conservation of our biodiversity outside the forest area or protected areas. Okay, so there are several limitations for these conservation strategies in India. The reason for conservation have been largely aesthetic. Okay, we are not considering the socio-ecological aspects. Similarly, most of the institutions and instruments are assuming spatially and temporally static situations without considering the long-term the conservation goals, without fixing the long-term conservation goals, and also the area. We are limiting the area because of some other reasons. Okay, political or some other reasons. We are fixing the area. We are drawing the outline of the protected area, but the animals don't know that outline area. So their home range is bigger than the outline drawn by the people, the officials. Okay, so the conservation is considered primarily at human landscape perspective. Okay, so simply forming spatial habitat mosaics, and we don't have solid criteria for declaring a national park or wildlife sanctuary. As I said, for declaring the key biodiversity area, IUCN is having that 11 criteria. So such checklist or criteria we should have for declaring a protected area or wildlife sanctuary. And the conservation relies heavily on protected areas, even though the ecological corridor function is still unclear. And also the invertebrates are underrepresented. We are still focusing on the mega charismatic animals, the tiger or the leopard or the elephant. Like we are not addressing the small creatures in this protected area or conservation point of view. Okay, so coming to the conclusions and the recommendations. The existing protected areas shall be widened. Okay, and the corridors connecting the protected areas shall be protected as conservation reserves. In between the protected area, the animals are moving. Okay, most of the area in Kerala and all, it's tea plantations and all. So several human wildlife conflicts happening because of this interruption in the animal movement. So the corridors between these protected areas should be identified, and that can be declared as conservation reserves. And other legal measures are needed to be needed to protect the biodiversity rich areas outside the notified forest area and also in the private land. So view habitat mosaics from the organism point of view, in addition to human landscape perspectives. And finally, the key tool in conservation is the public awareness, creating awareness among the public. And even this conference, this seminar is also we are addressing that point of concern. I wish this seminar should bring should create more awareness among the public through dissemination of whatever recommendations or the outcomes of this seminar through dissemination and all.